restrictions on NGO registration, efforts to silence bloggers. I hope we will see progress on this issue, and especially in Egypt, where that country's vibrant civil society has often been subjected to government pressure in the form of canceled conferences, harassing phone calls, frequent reminders that the government can close organizations down, even detention and long-term imprisonment and exile. In Central Asian countries, constitutions actually guarantee the right of association, but governments still place onerous restrictions on NGO activity, often through legislation or stringent registration requirements. Venezuela's leaders have tried to silence independent voices that seek to hold that government accountable. In Russia, while we welcome President Medvedev's statements in support of the rule of law, human rights activists and journalists have been targeted for assassination, and virtually none of these crimes have been solved. And we continue to engage on civil society issues with China, where writer Liu Xiaobao is serving an 11-year prison sentence because he co-authored a document calling for respect for human rights and democratic reform. Too many governments are seeing civic activists as opponents rather than partners. And as democracies, we must recognize that this trend is taking place against a broader backdrop. In the 20th century, crackdowns against civil society frequently occurred under the guise of ideology. Since the demise of communism, most crackdowns seem to be motivated instead by sheer power politics. But behind these actions, there is an idea, an alternative conception of how societies should be organized. And it is an idea that democracies must challenge. It is a belief that people are subservient to their government rather than government being subservient to their people. Now, this idea does not necessarily preclude citizens from forming groups that help their communities or promote their culture or even support political causes, but it requires these private organizations to seek the state's approval and to serve the state's and the state's leadership's larger agenda. Think for a moment about the civil society activists around the world who have recently been harassed, censored, cut off from funding, arrested, prosecuted, even killed. Why did they provoke such persecution? Some weren't engaged in political work at all. Some were not trying to change how their countries were governed. Most were simply getting help to people in need, like the Burmese activists in prison for organizing relief for victims of Cyclone Nargis. Some of them were exposing problems like corruption that their own governments claim they want to root out. Their offense was not just what they did, but the fact that they did it independently of their government. They were out doing what we would call good deeds, but doing them without permission. That refusal to allow people the chance to organize in support of a cause larger than themselves, but separate from the state, represents an assault on one of our fundamental democratic values. The idea of pluralism is integral to our understanding of what it means to be a democracy. Democracies recognize that no one entity, no state, no political party, no leader will ever have all the answers to the challenges we face. And depending on their circumstances and traditions, people need the latitude to work toward and select their own solutions. Our democracies do not and should not look the same. Governments by the people, for the people, and of the people will look like the people they represent. But we all recognize the reality and importance of these differences. Pluralism flows from these differences. And because crackdowns on NGOs are a direct threat to pluralism, they also endanger democracy. More than 60 years ago, Winston Churchill came to the United States to warn the world's democracies of an iron curtain descending across Europe. Today, thankfully, and thanks to some of you in this room, that iron curtain has fallen. But we must be wary of the steel vice in which many governments around the world are slowly crushing civil society and the human spirit. Today, meeting together as a community of democracies, it is our responsibility to address this crisis. Some of the countries engaging in these behaviors still claim to be democracies because they have elections. But as I've said before, democracy requires far more than an election. It has to be a 365-day-a-year commitment by governments and citizens alike to live up to the fundamental values of democracy and accept the responsibilities of self-government. Democracies don't fear their own people. They recognize that citizens must be free to come together, to advocate and agitate, to remind those entrusted with governance that they derive their authority from the governed. Restrictions on these rights only demonstrate the fear of illegitimate rulers, the cowardice of those who deny their citizens the protections they deserve. An attack on civic activism and civil society is an attack on democracy. Now, sometimes I think that the leaders who are engaging in these actions truly believe they are acting in the best interests of their country. But they begin to conflate their own political interests with the interests of that country. And they begin to believe that they must stay in office by any means necessary because only they can protect their country from all manner of danger. Part of what it requires to be a true democracy is to understand that political power must be passed on, and that despite the intensity of elections, once the elections are over, whoever is elected fairly and freely must then try to unify the country despite the political division. I ran a very hard race against President Obama. I tried with all my might to beat him. I was not successful. And when he won, much to my surprise, he asked me to join his administration to serve as Secretary of State. Well, in many countries, I learned as I began traveling, that was a matter of great curiosity. How could I work with someone whom I had tried to deprive of the office that he currently holds? But the answer for both President Obama and I was very simple. We both love our country. Politics is an important part of the lifeblood of a democracy. But governing, changing people's lives for the better, is the purpose one runs for office. In the community of democracies, we have to begin asking the hard questions. Whether countries that follow the example of authoritarian states and participate in this assault on civil society can truly call themselves democracies. And to address this challenge, civil society groups and democratic governments must come together around some common goals. The community of democracies is already bringing together governments and civil society organizations, some of whom are represented here. And it is well suited to lead these efforts. I know that the Community of Democracies Working Group on Enabling and Protecting Civil Society is already working to turn this vision into a reality. And the United States pledges to work with this community to develop initiatives that support civil society and strengthen governments committed to democracy. With the leadership and support of countries like Lithuania, Poland, Canada, and Mongolia, I believe that the community's 20th anniversary could be a celebration of the expanding strength of civil society and the true institutionalization of the habits of the heart that undergird democracy. To make that happen, our joint efforts, I believe, should include at least 4 elements. First, the community of democracies should work to establish, as Radek recommended, an objective